Thank you for joining us again for our second session for today on Rare Disease Day. It is my pleasure to introduce our next group of speakers. My name is Jackie Britton. I'm one of the genetic counselors here at Johns Hopkins. And now we will be hearing from a group talking to us about From Odyssey to Innovation, a rare disease journey toward an N of 1 trial. We have Rob Schrier. Rob Schrier is the Chief of Staff of the Asymmetric Operations Center at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. Prior to his role there, he spent almost 4 decades in federal government working national security. And as you will see today, he is here both in his APL capacity and also in his capacity as a caregiver and advocate for nano-rare disease treatments. We have Justin McArthur. Dr. McArthur is a professor of neurology, epidemiology, medicine, and pathology at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and the neurologist in chief of Johns Hopkins Hospital. He is nationally and internationally recognized for his work in studying the natural history, development, and treatment of HIV infection, multiple sclerosis, and other neurological infections and immune-mediated neurologic disorders. We have Tracy Speed. Dr. Speed is an associate professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences. She directs the pain treatment program, the chronic pancreatitis pain program, and is director of psychiatric services of the personalized pain program. Her clinical research focuses on enhancing access to and engagement in multidisciplinary pain care. And we have Eric Mallack. Dr. Eric Mallack is Director of Clinical Research at the Moser Center for Leukodystrophies at Kennedy Krieger Institute and Assistant Professor of Neurology at Johns Hopkins. His research centers on understanding brain development in disease and enhancing prediction of onset and progression in cerebral adrenoleukodystrophy, including the development of quantitative MRI models and evidence-based clinical guidelines. All right, and without further ado, here are our speakers.
Good morning. Can you guys all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a privilege for us to get to speak to you today about one of the nano-rare diseases and one journey. We're going to tell you a story. It's somewhat of a personal story, but it's also an important medical story. It's centered on my wife Heidi's disease journey, but it's more focused on what we're actually doing about it. Heidi suffers from adult polyglucosan body disease, APBD. You can see that on the slide. There's only a few hundred documented cases worldwide. It's a hereditary disease that affects older adults. In case you can't see the blue box that's obscured on the bottom, the most important part may be that in Heidi's case, she has constant severe pain, which is a symptom that not everyone has. Let's see. Oh, it worked. Heidi has APBD, but let's not define her by it. She's a wife, a mother, a grandmother, a friend, a confidant, an artist. I hope you got a chance to see her paintings out there, and a former art teacher. Unfortunately, though, as with many other nano-rare diseases, trying to keep her going does dominate our lives. She's had growing symptoms since 2010, which became more noticeable each year. Her symptoms became debilitating by around 2018, and she stopped driving in 2020. She was very fortunate that she was admitted to the NIH Undiagnosed Disease Program in early 2018, and that was the program that diagnosed her after almost 8 years being diagnosed. Interestingly enough, not only does she have this disease, but she has a far rarer version of this nano-rare disease with a deep intronic mutation. As Heidi grew worse, we were contacted by a researcher at Columbia who wanted to submit 4 to 5 deep intronic mutation patients to a nonprofit drug company named n-Lorem, which they did in the fall of 2021. And n-Lorem quickly accepted this research proposal. As Heidi continued to grow worse, unfortunately, we didn't hear anything from the Columbia staff. The only way we were keeping up with what was going on is I had developed a relationship with staff in n-Lorem. n-Lorem, for anyone who doesn't know it, is a visionary, deeply caring nonprofit company. They exist to illustrate the efficacy of ASO therapy as a key disease treatment. They're great people. They really want to help as many people as possible. And I think they have an admirable egalitarian approach to choosing patients to treat. You don't get to the front of the line because you have more money or more prestige. By July 2024, when it became apparent to me that there was no imminent trial for Heidi, and the Columbia doctors had not really gotten to know Heidi either as a person or a medical patient. This was in stark contrast to her engagements with the Hopkins medical team, three of whom are here today, who already knew her both as a patient and a person. So that's when I decided to go to Dr. McArthur with a carefully crafted, very detailed proposal for Johns Hopkins Medicine to execute Heidi's clinical trial. I built quite a case. In helping Heidi, JHM would be giving hope to GSD patients more broadly, glycogen storage disease patients. It would help forge a stronger partnership between JHM and KKI and NLORM that would help the expanding number of clinical trials that both JHM and KKI physicians had applied to NLORM for across the board for a whole spectrum of nano-rare diseases. I offered that we could use Heidi's trial process to help learn lessons to improve Hopkins' delivery of clinical trials in general, and we've been learning lots of lessons. And finally, it would help solidify Hopkins' prominent role in nano-rare disease trials as a center of excellence, which, as you heard from Ada this morning, Johns Hopkins now is. And I expected this to be the first round of a very protracted negotiation. But this is Dr. McArthur we're talking about. There was no protracted negotiation. There was actually no negotiation. He immediately said, hey, let's try to do this. And the rest is history, as you'll hear today. His decision was game-changing on many levels. Dr. McArthur was already, and is to this day, Heidi's quarterback doctor, a phrase that he coined himself. He knows her very well, both medically and personally, and he's even made several house calls. So immediately, I no longer felt like I was trying to navigate through the entire medical system on my own. Heidi and I already have a major partnership with Hopkins, and we play an active role in that partnership. One key point I want to make is you need a medical team, which you'll see this morning, and the patient and the caregiver, though, have to be an active role in the team, not just a passive participant. So what's being an active role look like? First, it means we do everything we can ourselves to try to maintain Heidi's health. I think you'll hear Dr. Speed reinforcing that point in her talk. Heidi put herself on an extremely low carbohydrate diet to try to slow disease progression. She's been on that diet for more than 4 years now. We try to exercise daily. We try to keep her legs moving. We have physical therapists, occupational therapists, and a masseuse come to the house every week. And now we also have nurses come twice a week. We increased our level of caregivers to cover 24/7, including me prominently on that team. So I'm still her primary caregiver, but we have caregivers around the clock. Heidi and I have deep daily conversations to help keep her cognitive skills as sharp as possible, and mine, because she's about 50 times smarter than I am. Right. And even during her last hospitalization at Suburban Hospital, I sat down as soon as I got there with the head of the ward, and we carved out a partnership plan to care for Heidi while she was in the hospital, where I actually took a major role because the type of care she needs, a lot of times the nurses on a ward just don't have enough time to give to that. And when I've had to learn medical procedures to perform them at home, I do that. We've also stayed tied into and active with several APBD research efforts, which have proved critical as well. We were an early and we're an active participant in the Duke University Natural History study for APBD. Their study actually helped our clinical trial team in the formulation of a clinical trial protocol because they had put so much data together. We also volunteered to support a KKI MRI research effort led by Dr. Nirbhay Yadav. Thank you. To identify and quantify glycogen in cells. Heidi's done 2 voluntary special MRIs, and while this is still a research effort, that research has reached the point that it's so sound that her that these MRIs are actually part of her protocol now for clinical trial. So another key point is you have to stay tied in and try to drive the research effort and not just be a passive observer. Somebody's not muted, and you're making me sound like a bad version of Max Headroom. And you just laughed at that. Okay. So now I want to make just a very brief plug for both the biology and technology data work that we do at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. If you have a chance today, stop by the table we have out there. You might think like, how is this related to medical work? You won't think that after you stop by and speak to the team that's out there. I also have developed a proposed strategy for accelerating finding effective treatments for nano-rare diseases across the board. Anybody who's interested later today, I'm happy to share my thoughts on that. Dealing with a debilitating nano-rare disease is tough and it's heartbreaking. I'm sure everybody in the room already knows that. I don't want to focus on that. Rather, I want to talk for a second about hope. Hope can be crucial, but hope is even more powerful when you couple it with focused action. Then it becomes a powerful weapon. You also need patience, and I realize it's hard in these situations, but as you heard from our last speakers, it's a long journey to get to clinical trials, and you have to try to stick with it. I've described some of the actions of remaining hopeful, and I'm hopeful today, even though we have a story without an ending, as many people do. So again, key point is stay hopeful, but couple that hope with action. Finally, we need a team approach and with a quarterback factor. We've talked about the team in broad concept. But I want to talk about one of the key members of the team who's not here today is Heidi's primary care physician, where we specifically chose a primary care physician who wanted to be engaged and stayed informed in her clinical trial. When, by the way, we searched long and hard before we found a doctor that was able to do that. As you can see, we have a large array of other specialists that have been involved in it besides the people that you're going to hear on the stage now. And I know they've been introduced, but I want to quickly reintroduce them in a different way before I turn it over to Dr. McArthur. So Dr. McArthur has been her quarterback doctor, and in our first meeting, he said, "You know more about this disease than I do." Whether or not that's true, that's what he said. I will just say that I would almost defy anyone to find a patient besides my wife that has had many creative, innovative treatment attempts over the last 6 or 7 years. Dr. Tracy Speed, who's been trying to help Heidi through her terrible, terrible pain issues, has been about as creative as any doctor could be. And even though we haven't found success yet, there is a degree of success in trying and knowing that you have somebody trying and in your corner as well. And finally, Dr. Eric Mallack, who just jumped in with both feet into Heidi's clinical trial, and he's now her principal investigator, probably learning more about the non-medical processes of Johns Hopkins and KKI than he ever wanted to learn, and he's just sticking with it. So with that, I want to turn it over to Dr. McArthur.
So it has truly been an honor to work with Heidi and Rob for the last few years, and I am as excited as they are at the prospect of this N of 1 trial that we hope to begin very soon. I think it's clear to all of you that their determination, fortitude, and courage has propelled this project forward. I have rarely cared for a patient with this level of commitment to regain health. Heidi, and Heidi's on the Zoom, you are truly an inspiration to me and many others. And Rob, as a caregiver, you are simply remarkable. We're so hopeful that this trial will begin soon. It has been a challenge to corral 3 organizations, NLORM, KKI, and JHU, into a workable legal contract, but we will get there. What I wanted to do today in the few minutes that I have is talk about the power of advocacy and the responsibility that we as providers have to advocate for our patients. Of course, academic medicine is centered on 3 pillars: clinical care, research, and education. But I want to add a 4th pillar, advocacy. I want to begin with a simple truth. Advocacy is medicine. It may not come in a vial or show up on an MRI scan, but for patients living with chronic rare diseases like Heidi's, advocacy can be as vital as any prescription. It is the engine that drives awareness, research, and ultimately access to care. When we talk about chronic rare diseases, we're actually talking about the statistic that rare diseases impact over 25 million Americans, not so rare. Behind every statistic lies a person who has spent years searching for answers, often through pain, uncertainty, and invisibility. For them, advocacy is not abstract, it's survival. Many of these patients endure what's often called the diagnostic Odyssey, as Rob detailed. Years of symptoms, referrals, and mislabeling before someone finally names the disease. During this journey, advocacy begins, sometimes quietly, with a parent who refuses to accept "we don't know," or a patient who keeps pushing for one more test to find the answer. Heidi and Rob are great examples of this. As clinicians and researchers, we must recognize that our roles extend beyond diagnosis and treatment. We are also translators, educators, and sometimes the first advocates on a patient's behalf. Small acts, listening, documenting clearly, connecting a patient to a registry, can change the trajectory of a patient's life. As Francis Peabody, the great Harvard physician, said, the secret of the care of the patient is in caring for the patient. So advocacy gains power when individual voices become collective ones. Organizations like NORD or the APPD Foundation have transformed research agendas and policy landscapes. The creation of the Orphan Drug Act, for example, emerged directly from patient advocacy, a testament to what can happen when determined individuals mobilize around a shared purpose. Advocacy for our patients also matters within institutions, especially complex and bureaucratic organizations like Hopkins, of course not KKI, that change only slowly. When physicians champion early screening programs, establish multidisciplinary clinics, or advocate for flexible trial designs, as for Heidi, we can create change beyond our own patients. Every time we push a grant committee, an insurer, or a regulatory body to see the person, not just the paperwork, we redefine what equitable care looks like. In rare disease research, the scientific excitement of a novel mutation or a pathophysiological mechanism should never eclipse the human face behind it. Advocacy bridges that gap. It reminds us that every data point in a natural history study corresponds to a lived experience. The parent tracking symptoms overnight, the patient participating in a study despite travel and cost. As physicians and researchers, we are in a unique position to amplify these narratives responsibly, to bring them to advisory boards, funding panels, and classrooms. The science advances faster when it is fueled by empathy and grounded in the voices of those we serve. So what does this mean for us, clinicians, scientists, caregivers? It means using our expertise and our credibility, not just within our disciplines, but also in public spaces where decisions are made. It means mentoring trainees to see advocacy as part of professionalism and not just a passion project. It means sharing power, inviting patients to co-design studies, to sit on panels, and to critique the systems that affect them. Ultimately, advocacy transforms despair into direction. For someone living with a chronic rare condition, knowing that their story matters to science, to medicine, to society can be profoundly healing. So let's remember that our voices, our data, our influence all carry weight. When we align them in the service of those who too often feel invisible, we make the invisible visible. And that is the true power of advocacy. Patients don't care much how much you know until they know how much you care. So patient advocacy isn't optional or heroic. It's the ordinary work of making sure our patients get the care we'd want for ourselves. Thank you.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I also want to thank Rob for the invitation to be part of this panel and to be sharing with you today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about chronic pain in the context of trying to help Heidi through that. I'm not part of the N of 1 trial, but I would say I oftentimes tell my patients that working with their chronic pain conditions and trying to help them, we are doing an N of 1 trial in the chronic pain world. And I will echo what Dr. McArthur was saying. In chronic pain, it really is also making the invisible become visible to the patient and providers. Let me see. So with all conditions in chronic pain, I can take away from patients a lot of different lessons. And the reality is that everything in the human body has an effect on everything else. And oftentimes we have this divide between medicine and psychiatry, but there's no division. That's an illusion to say that the brain and the body aren't connected. We see the world through the lens of our specialty. And in some ways, it's beneficial that medicines become so specialized because we can treat these nano-rare disorders. But at the same time, it creates these silos where patients with rare disorders oftentimes are just bouncing between the walls of different providers and rarely find a home base. Having a Dr. McArthur as the quarterback is pretty rare. And if you're treating patients, then it's very likely that you are seeing people with chronic pain, because chronic pain affects 1 in 5 individuals in our country, and it is more prevalent than diabetes, heart disease, stroke, and cancer combined. So it's important that we're thinking about pain and acknowledging it as something that is real and that's problematic. And even again, in these rare disorders, not every single person is going to have pain. So when a patient has pain, we want to believe it and appreciate that it's real. About 8% of individuals have disabling pain. So their pain becomes something that can change their identity and can shape their day-to-day. It can be associated with hopelessness, apathy. Patients get demoralized by going from doctor to doctor. They can feel fatigued and start to lose interest in things. And then with that becomes this web of other challenges, ranging from disability, isolating oneself from friends or family or coworkers, sometimes starting to develop dependence on substances like opioids or benzodiazepines. Certainly having sleep problems is so common with chronic pain. And then sometimes patients turn towards risky behaviors or just not seeking medical care because they've given up. So when patients come to see me, they're coming to see a psychiatrist, and they're always asking, does that mean I'm crazy? And the answer is no. It means, again, that your brain and your body are connected. And I'm going to work with patients to understand how to manage their pain. In order to untangle that intense web of comorbidity and psychosocial stressors, I'll kind of start with a hypothesis. What are we trying to do to help manage your pain? And to break down that complexity, kind of try to simplify it to, we know that damaged nerves produce aberrant signals, and that aberrant signal is chronic pain. So we want to identify that pain, because again, just because you have a rare disease doesn't mean you should have pain. And so I'm going to provide a workup to try to understand why that person has pain. When Heidi saw me, I also kind of sent her through a similar workup. We're trying to understand, is there some type of small fiber neuropathy contributing to a pain? Is there something happening with the enteric nervous system or our gut that could be contributing to pain? What is it about the neurological exam or nerve conduction studies that can contribute to a diagnosis of pain? If patients have an autonomic nervous system dysfunction, or a concern of that, send them for a tilt table test, and then look for various immune markers or autoimmune conditions or endocrine dysfunction that could be contributing and driving that chronic pain. With that workup, I'm able to make a diagnostic formulation. Sometimes those results don't really yield much, and I have to explain to a patient, well, I think your nerves are damaged. In Heidi's case, it's a little bit easier. We know her nerves are damaged, and so we can work on then trying to figure out how we can help those nerves heal. And so here's where the N of 1 trial comes into clinical care. there's no algorithm or textbook to be able to manage chronic pain for each individual. And so we have to do trial and errors of different medications using the knowledge we have in the pharmacology of the different medications. And certainly we've been through a lot of trial and errors in Heidi's case in terms of managing her pain. But with those errors or with those side effects, sometimes there's small victories, and sometimes that helps inform maybe what the pathology is that's driving the pain. We're also talking a lot about rehabilitation. So both physical rehabilitation and social engagement, as well as psychological rehabilitation. And then the treatment involves both pharmacology and behavioral goals. And so pharmacologic, we're working on reducing that pathological process of the damaged nerves and working on reversing any associated conditions. So things like insomnia or depression. If a patient comes to see me, one of the first goals that we're going to talk about is that we're going to be working on enhancing their quality of life, supporting longevity, improving function. So we're really thinking about that quality of life. And again, treatment's going to be focusing on how are we going to try to help heal these damaged nerves. So one is to try to improve the signal to noise ratio of damaged nerves. So I tend to think of, we all have a smoke detector in the house, and I'm short and it always seems to go away when no one else is in the house, right? But then you find the battery, you replace the smoke detector, and the thing still chirps. That's how I think about chronic pain, is even though maybe the initial injury is there, the body keeps warning itself of danger, keeps sending signals. So we're trying to tune down those signals. We can use medications that help stabilize nerve membranes, as well as physical activity to help tune down that process. We're also trying to amplify signals that might be worsening the pain. So if your autonomic nervous system is overactive, that can drive pain. So we're trying to use approaches to reduce that. A lot of patients have depression or anxiety associated with their pain. So I'm focusing on helping to treat that depression as well. And then decreasing any type of noxious sensation or things that when individuals can really focus on that pain. And then again, trying to focus on ways to reduce any of the underlying nerve damage. And so sometimes that's trying to suppress the immune system, improving diet, improving the inflammatory processes. A lot of times patients say, you want to put me on so many medications, or I'm on so many meds. And the reality is that we know now that chronic pain can't be treated with just one medication. It's a multimodal approach that can be at times successful. So in Heidi's case, I work on trying to add one medicine and then trying to maximize that medicine, but I also might be trying to add some other medicines and other modalities as well, so we can try to tackle pain from all these different pathways. So as we're going through treatment, it's important to realize that pain is a real disease. I actually had a patient just this week who said, "Is my pain fake?" I said, "No, you're experiencing your pain. That is real." And so it is a very subjective experience, and sometimes it really is invisible because we can't find the source of pain, but that doesn't take away the reality that that pain is there. And I try to help patients explain, your nerves are damaged. Even if we can't find that exact nerve and our technology is not there yet, we understand that the nerves are damaged. The good news is that we can modulate our nervous system, and so there are ways that we can seek treatments. Depression is a treatable disease, and antidepressants can help modulate nerves and reduce pain. They can do that even if you don't have depression, and more so when you do have depression. And importantly, physical activity is something that can really help improve the signal to noise ratio. The number one order on my Epic set is referral to physical therapy. It's the first thing that always comes up, because so many of my patients, I'm asking them to go to physical therapy. Again, not because I don't believe their pain is real or because we can't treat other ways, but it's so important to be physically active every single day. And lastly, for any providers in the room, just as a reminder, I was trained to be a therapeutic optimist. I think it's really important that we can provide that therapeutic optimism for our patients, or hope. Accept serendipity whenever you find it, even if there's a slight reduction in pain or a day without pain. That's exciting because that means that that's possible and we can continue to reach towards that possibility. And as Winston Churchill said, never, 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 never give up. So thank you.
All right, perfect. So I'm here to talk for the next 10 minutes, really about the nitty gritty of the protocol and the regulatory process. I don't have any slides because I'm not going to make you read about it and listen to me talk about it simultaneously. So really the regulatory process and getting the pieces of the NF1 trial up and running comes in three parts. Part number one is the protocol itself. So understanding how to write a clinical trial protocol that matches the patient. And that comes with an interaction with the FDA. We have to hold an IND. The second piece of it is the contracting process, which Dr. McArthur had alluded to a little bit earlier. And we are in a unique situation where, as Dr. Fatimi said earlier today, where we have quite a powerful group in terms of collaboration between the Kennedy Krieger Institute and Johns Hopkins. But as you can imagine, a tri-party contract between three major groups can become, it feels like, cubically more complicated. And then the last part is the IRB. So this is really sort of how did we do it? I'll start at the bottom and work my way up in terms of the protocol. So I was brought onto this project by Dr. McArthur, which again, thank you for introducing me to Rob and Heidi, and really meeting Heidi, albeit via Zoom. And we spent a fair amount of time on that call. And it was me more or less listening and just learning as much as I could about her. And, you know, out of that interaction, you get a sense of where she is mapped onto the natural history of disease. So that's kind of step one. Here's how we expect the disease to go. And if you are going to have a personalized trial protocol, where is your patient along that trajectory? Because then you have to build in outcomes that will fit the expected trajectory moving that point forward. So we got a sense of where Heidi was. And then thinking about her, as Rob pointed out earlier, her chief complaint really being debilitating pain, and then also building in fatigue, motor scales, cognitive scales. Picking tools that will capture her not only now, but expected in terms of moving forward, and that we expect to change according to the natural history of disease. As Rob pointed out earlier, engagement in other research is paramount, and it served Heidi really well in this project. She's enrolled in a natural history study with Duke, and she's been doing this for 2 or 3 years now. It allowed us to interface with that team, and we're working on a collaboration, details to be determined, but a collaboration about what outcomes were they collecting that we can build into the program. And so based on what they were collecting, we took some of their outcome measures, for which they have 2 to 3 years of longitudinal data at this point, and put it into the trial protocol to then continue and hopefully watch the trajectory of those changes, the trajectory of those measurements change with respect to the therapy. So we built in collaboration and pre-existing outcome measures that she's already been subjected to. And then we interfaced with Dr. Nirbe, who designed a brain glycogen MRI protocol, which we will do here at the Kirby Center, in addition to the standard MR procedures. There are 2 other people that Rob introduced us to who are studying the disease, and they have assays for for glycogen in the urine. So that'll be a send-out test. And then looking at the enzyme activity in blood. So now, through that network, through their advocacy and through the network that Rob and his team have put together, we pulled all those people together and centralized them onto the protocol. So now we have something where we think we can measure Heidi's progress over the ensuing years. And really, with this treatment, it's going to be for her lifetime. We have imaging biomarkers, urine, blood, and then all of the patient reported and patient clinical outcomes. So that's the specific part of her protocol. As it turns out, there are 2 other patients, so for 3 total, who are eligible to be treated with this same ASO. So when we took our protocol and brought it up to the NLORM, the foundation level, we met the 2 other investigators, and we sat down and said, okay, we all have individualized protocols for individual patients. What are the common data elements that we need to collect? where does the Venn diagram overlap, and do we have to add anything in? And so through that process, we take something out here, add something in there, but the concept is 80% of the protocol is Heidi specific, and this is going to add to more than 100% for a reason, and then 50% of the protocol are common data elements. Okay. So that's sort of where we were with round 2 of the draft of the protocol for Heidi. The next step up was then to present that protocol and really present Heidi's case from start to finish to the NLORM Foundation. They have something called a STAR meeting, where they have a board of really senior physicians and scientists who have been doing this for a while, who are either involved in the development, one of whom is a friend and mentor of mine, Richard Finkel, who you may know was heavily involved in the Spinraza project, who's now at St. Jude. So they have people like that sit, and you present the protocol, and then you sit there and sweat a little bit, and they pick you apart. And it's all for good reason, right? You want external validation in sort of what you're looking to propose. They gave us really nice feedback, revised the protocol once more, and at that point there has to be an agreement between the treating team, the family, and NLORM, where then through KKI and through our regulatory process, we submitted it to the FDA, and the FDA has a review process. They have 30 days to get back to you. And then they got back to us, thankfully, with pretty minimal comments. We were able to turn that back around and have it submitted. So now I hold the IND for Heidi's protocol. So those are sort of the granular steps, starting at the basement and working your way up to the top floor. Once you have the FDA approved protocol, two things can happen, or two things have to happen. One, you can then move on to the IRB, because now you have a protocol in hand, FDA approval letter, and you submit the IRB. And as most people know, if you don't, but Kennedy Krieger shares the IRB infrastructure with Johns Hopkins. We use the Johns Hopkins IRB. Our regulatory people know it far better than I do, but we know that it's going to go through a series of subcommittees and take some time to come back. In parallel to that, because this is the first time this protocol is being, this program, this N of 1 program funded by us and insurance, but supported by NLORM, while the IRB is project and patient specific, on the institutional side, the aim is to create a 3-party contract that is an umbrella contract that will cover all the terms and conditions for any other NLORM-based N of 1 ASO projects that come through KKI and Johns Hopkins, which, as you can imagine, as Rob alluded to, I have learned more about regulatory and contracting than I would have ever asked for in 2 lifetimes, let alone this one. But we are pushing to get it done, and I think the Institute understands that this is not only a priority for the patients, but it should be an institutional priority as well. So the result will be, hopefully, once we are able to start treating Heidi with a contract in place and approved IRB, and we already have the protocol in hand, the process then will theoretically be anybody between institutions who wants to treat a patient with an ASO manufactured by NLORM, they would not need to recontract. They would submit their own IRB. They would probably have to still go through the entire protocol process with the foundation itself, with that expert review. But the idea is that this will become pipelined and then expand. So this first pass use case is hopefully clearing the way for what I hope to be a pathway that grows and becomes more aerodynamic over time. All right, so I'll stop there and let Rob finish up.
Okay, I just want to leave you with a couple quick points, and I hope this talk was useful to you. First, I wanted to talk about the nth order effect, because we just focused a lot of energy on an hour on what sounds like just one person, one patient. But if we have some success, which again, I'm hopeful, I believe we will have success, that's going to impact the broader APBD disease community, the glycogen storage disease 4 and possibly beyond community. Beyond that, it's going to have an impact on nano-rare diseases in general. As you just heard Dr. Mallack say, and again, we volunteered to be the guinea pig, so we knew there would be pain involved, that once this contract problem is resolved, I know of numerous physicians at Johns Hopkins and Kennedy Krieger that have patients that are like teed up that they want to be treated by N-Lorem on a whole wide variety of diseases, none of which I believe are like glycogen storage diseases. Also, I've been feeding back, because this is like how I do it from my national security background, as we're learning lessons along the way, even clinical trial process lessons, I'm feeding it back in, and I'm in part of Dr. Nance's gene therapy learning group, and I'm feeding back anything we learn. So again, it might be painful. The second point, which I couldn't walk away without making, is I was excited that Johns Hopkins Medicine and Kennedy Krieger Institute together was named a Rare Disease Center of Excellence. And I know that there was a rubric that they went through, and you can read online the criteria by which they were decided. But I want to offer a more simplified alternative criteria for that. The experience that Heidi and I have had with the array of doctors, nurses, and the other medical and research professionals at both JHM and KKI had me conclude one thing. Like most endeavors in life, this is all about people. And I've just never met a more deeply caring, kind, creative, and frankly tenacious group of professionals. And to me, I think that's the core for any endeavor of creating a center of excellence.
Thank you so much to our speakers for this talk. This was absolutely wonderful. Thank you, everyone.